Hi everyone, it's Gene, and today I want to talk about encrypted communications and whether or not we should have backdoors in them. This is a very contentious debate because encrypted backdoors are enormously important. They could either solve all of humanity's crimes, or at least the crimes in the United States, or they could result in mass loss of privacy and economic damage. So we're going to be examining all of the both sides of the debate, and we'll come to a conclusion as to whether or not this is a good thing or a bad thing, or if it's kind of mixed. So first, I think it's clear to look at the affirmative side, because that's the side that's actually very unpopular among people, which is the reason that something like this, the backdoors and encrypted communications, has actually not happened. But first of all, let's give some definitions, because this is kind of hard. Encrypted communications generally refer to something called end-to-end encrypted or E2EE communications, and basically those are like the things that we see like WhatsApp, Instagram, well, WhatsApp, at least Facebook, iMessage, all those things like are very encrypted, meaning that it's very, very hard, just practically impossible to get through that. And this is like a trend that's actually been happening since the 2000s, when people really started thinking, hey, I want some privacy, right? And this really led to an enormous boom in encryption. So these days, it's kind of rare to see something without encryption, or at least like the big apps all have encryption, right? Now, this has become a very big problem for law enforcement, because like agencies such as the FBI or the police have said that this has, made it hard to investigate, has made it hard to like prevent crimes, has made it hard to say that person was the one who did it, right? Because they have no evidence, and the only evidence that they could have is from the text messages, the video, the calls that the person made. But since they're with encrypted communications, they can't access them. And there's a very famous case in 2014 in San Bernardino, when a couple shot a lot of people, and it was horrible, right? And the FBI obviously wanted to see, we want to find out what this couple was doing, because maybe we can like link it to a terrorist group, right? And so they asked Apple, hey, can we access encrypted communications, because these people had iPhones, right? And so Apple was like, well, I think that's a very big privacy breach. And Apple CEO Tim Cook went as far as to say that this seemed like a very big overreach by the US government, and therefore it would not comply with even the court order. And at the end of the day, the FBI accessed the phone via another hacking service, but think that hacking services are expensive. They're stuff like Pegasus, which is Israeli spyware company, basically that hacks into phones, is very powerful. Like if you get a text, or if you like click a link, what happens is that the app can basically track everything that you're doing, and it's just actually kind of crazy, right? And so people, and that's what they use, but it costs millions of dollars. And so what people have said is, the FBI obviously does not have the budget to spend millions of dollars on one case when there's thousands of cases. That would be billions of dollars, and there's just not enough money going around, right? And so what the FBI is saying is, hey, what about we catch the criminals by creating these backdoors, which means we can go online where there's like 400,000 messages being exchanged every single year by criminals, and we can catch child exploitation, drug and human trafficking, and international terrorism, right? Terrorism kills millions of people every single year. Drug overdoses kills 100,000 people in 2022. Child exploitation is one of the largest problems across the globe, affecting millions of children. And that means if we can even access a bit of these encrypted communications, imagine the good that we could do. At the same time, they're held accountable because of warrants, because they still have to comply with the Fourth Amendment, and therefore the only way that they could actually access one of these things is via a court order, meaning that they're always keeping to legal standards while solving all of the crime. Now that's the FBI's point of view. Now, what other people have said is that this is not true. And there's not only that argument, like there's a bunch of arguments out there. So we're gonna go into a lot of other reasons why, this is kind of favorable, but the biggest reason is just saying crime. Now, some people say this is not true because they say, look, if a child exploiter, for example, or a terrorist group, they already use their own apps. They already can download their own encryption packages from online. And since we're going to focus on the United States for clarity, they can literally just say, oh, WhatsApp, which is a US app, is now being spun on the US. Okay, let's move on to Telegram or Signal, which are like German-based and Russian-based, right? And then they're completely off the radar again. Or a lot of people already have their own encrypted apps. So another big argument that people are going to say is, okay, sure, maybe we're not going to be able to like have this as a long-term solution. But when we saw, like, for example, when we saw like the first explosion of crime catching when, like none of the criminals were expecting it, that's still probably going to save hundreds of thousands of lives, right? Like, if this is enough to take out a big terrorist group or, drug trafficking like organization, if this is enough to take out a few thousand child exploiters, that's still going to be an enormous impact that could last for generations. But most people just say, these people are very sophisticated at cloaking their activities, right? They respond very fast to these reports. They can just use code words, right? Finding the warrants takes a long time, and word spreads around pretty quickly. And some people even say they're already using their own apps and their own websites. There's no reason why, like, these people are going to, like, even if there was an enormous, like, explosion of crime catching, they're already on their own websites, right? However, there is evidence that, maybe access to encrypted communications is good. Anom and Encrypted are key examples that it was when a lot of countries banded together and they said, let's stop some crime. And so they basically, through Operation Trojan Horse, they created this big chat and, like, it was marketed to criminal groups. And then, like, all the criminal groups were using it. And then, because the FBI was behind all of this, they had access to all the communications and they caught like 6,400 criminals. So it was a big, enormously successful operation. And so there are arguments say, look, encrypted communications can help, but other people just say, sure, maybe that's one example, but now people are going to be even more wary, and it's also different because, like, there's still, like, because once, like people are going to say, like, if you're a criminal and you're using this app, and then suddenly it's like the FBI invades it, then criminals are probably not going to be using these apps anymore. So it doesn't even matter because they're not using it any longer. So that impact lasted like, 2 weeks? So that, if we think about it like that, then it's pretty bad, right? Now, I also think that on the other side of the debate, there's always the argument that it's not going to work, right? But there's also more bad things that could happen. And one of the largest arguments, and this is probably going to be pretty obvious to you, is privacy. Because if the government can look at our pictures or our text messages, what does that mean? That means that a lot of the things that we really want to be private could be revealed. And the government says that it can use warrants, right? But some people point out, well, once the tool is in place, it doesn't really matter whether or not there are warrants. And, remember Edward Snowden and how he leaked the fact that the NSA was spying on millions of Americans? Sure, people can say, look, like, the NSA didn't have any excuse because they were breaking the law. And you can say, well, we're talking about lawful access, which is what the FBI wants to talk about. But the point is, like, once there is this backdoor that can literally be accessed, what is there to stop other agencies from just saying, what about we actually, like, surveil more Americans? And this is like a trend throughout history, and you can actually look at this, especially in like the 1900s. You can see this a lot because a lot of people wanted to spy on for example, like civil rights protesters, and then this just went on up until the NSA, for example, right? And so the surveillance idea, the fact that the government is surveilling Americans, it's not very new. It's been happening for a long time. And so that just means, hey, look, loss of presence, especially in the past. Like, I don't know about like the current future state of like encrypted communications and how the government is dealing with them, but especially in the past, we really saw a lot of like, for example, the NSA, or like people were also targeting Martin Luther King Jr., right? And so the argument is like, if they did it in the past, they can probably do it right now, right? So that's like the main argument, and it does make sense, right? The only other countries with backdoors are China and Russia, which tells you maybe this is dangerous, right? Maybe we shouldn't be like authoritarian countries. But even if people say, look, it's not going to be abused, right? And even if it is, like, if you've done nothing wrong, you've got nothing to hide. What do you have? You have a picture of your dog, right? You send a text asking somebody to buy more groceries, right? Like, you want them to buy milk, right? Like, the U.S. government probably isn't going to want to, like, it doesn't even have the time to look at your messages. So the chances that you're going to be surveilled are astronomically low. Second, the US government hasn't really done anything like the NSA for a long time. And third, again, if you've done nothing wrong, you've got nothing to hide. You're fine, right? Even if you believe that, right? And a lot of people do. And this idea about privacy, especially because it's like more philosophical and moral than like clear, I don't know, like it's not in dollars or lives, right? But if you want to go into dollars, the economic implications would be devastating as well. Because imagine if people had to make backdoors. That's incredibly hard to do, right? Backdoors, like, one of the main reasons that companies have not made backdoors is just because they don't like the idea of it, right? The fact that the government can just look at like consumers' information has never been a very popular one, and companies have been justified in worrying that if this happens, consumers could just move away. But second of all, one of the main reasons that they don't want to do it is because it's almost technologically impossible. If something like this had to happen, it will cost an enormous amount of money, and especially small companies, they could go bankrupt because they just don't have the resources to make backdoors. Think about it. You have to have your software, but then you have to make a backdoor, but it can't be accessible to anybody else. So it has to be incredibly strong against anybody else, but it has to be incredibly easy to access by law enforcement, and this all has to be integrated into your software. People just say it's really hard to make. And one of the things is because it's so hard to make, most people do it in a very sloppy manner. So that means that what could happen is it's done very sloppily. And if it's done very sloppily, what happens is that hackers can penetrate. In fact, most of the hacking that has happened, that has been directed at the United States, it's been done through backdoors. If you think of like, you probably see a lot of headlines. Hackers infiltrate the U.S. communications. Hackers infiltrate again U.S. Communications again. A lot of them were through backdoors, which tells you, first of all, backdoors in general, even the ones that are constructed well, they can let hackers in, which means that they can steal billions of dollars. For example, what if hackers got into the US bank system? The entire banking system will be cooked. We would see an enormous financial collapse. What if they got into critical, critical personal data, right? Personal databases. If they got into that, we could see enormous implications. So even a secure backdoor could have enormous implications. But because we're requiring everybody to do this, what could happen is that there's a lot of sloppily made backdoors, which would just exponentially increase the risk of this, while still costing a lot of companies an enormous amount of money, which would lead to economic downturn. And there's also the second thing. Consumers hate being surveilled, a lot of people say. Right? Consumers, they don't want to be surveilled. In fact, around like 90% of, like 60% of Americans say, like, this was a poll that was conducted in 2024. 60% of Americans said that they would just quit online experiences if they wanted to protect their data, which tells you a lot of people care about their privacy. In fact, a lot of people estimate that if there is like a negative impact to digital trust, which obviously if there's backdoors and something making the entire encryption that we so rely on less secure, what could happen is that we could just see enormous economic downturn because today's world is very tech dependent, right? We see artificial intelligence, we see Google, we see Meta, we see all these big companies that make up around like, I don't know, like 34% of the entire S&P 500, and they're all related to AI or stuff like that. Well, imagine if these companies suddenly lost a lot of trust. These people just moved to foreign products. So what's going to happen is that the U.S. companies are going to crash. We're going to see the stock market crash, the entire economy crash. This sounds very, very unrealistic. But during the Snowden revelations, what we saw was a drop from 35 to $120 billion because people suddenly thought, what? These people are spying on us? US products must not be safe. And we saw enormous drops in revenue. And for example, Google had to cut its cloud prices by 50%. It might have been Amazon or Google, I honestly don't remember. But sales dropped, we saw enormous blows, and obviously small threats to digital trust can have implications of $1 trillion or more. And we also saw this with the Australians' TOLA Act, TOLA Act, which basically does what we're talking about. There's a lot of different examples that tell us maybe this is not a very good idea. Maybe we're just going to see a lot of bad implications. Now, people have said this isn't going to happen. And, the fact that this can happen, the chance is pretty low. But we have seen that right now the economy is at a state where it's strong, it's growing. But some economists say, look, it's so dependent on technology. If technology investment went down even by a little bit, even though the US economy is doing pretty good right now, what we're going to see is that the economy is just going to crash, right? And that can lead to enormous implications. Now, some people say, hey, that still means that foreign products get more money. That means that foreign countries benefit. So sure, maybe the US goes down, but other economies benefit, other groups of people are helped. So at the end of the day, maybe we're just going to see underprivileged nations helped. But that's not really the case because the US is so powerful in its economy that if its economy goes down, the entire global economy goes down. Whereas if another entire global economy goes down, it's better if the US economy is strong than if another country's economy is strong for the global well-being, global economy's well-being, right? Now, there's a lot of other arguments. You can go really deep into this. There's so many arguments, but I think that it's really clear it's really important to just step back and look at all of this. It's a really big argument that really concerns, should we be solving crime or does that not work? Should we be solving privacy? Or is that just not a very valid argument? Should we be trying to protect our economy? And economy argument is honestly very strong. There's not a lot of arguments against it except for the fact that, this hasn't happened in the past. It's kind of unlikely. And hey, we've seen the US government interfere in the past. We haven't seen anything happen, but it still is a risk. And so I think that the lesson that I really want to leave off is that there is no right side. I would say that perhaps these people are wrong. If the FBI actually has hold of these tools, we could really see enormous changes. The first explosion of crime catching could catch thousands of criminals. We could see justice to thousands more. We could be able to help millions more and millions of victims. Maybe not catch the criminals, but help the victims. And a lot of not very smart criminals can't even really make these encryption packages, meaning that at the end of the day, we could consistently catch criminals, right? And it's better than doing nothing. On the other side, people say that privacy is a big issue. Some people say it's not a big issue. Some people say it is. Other people say that it could lead to enormous economic implications. At the end of the day, there's a lot of different arguments and there's no right answer. As we go into a world where technology is number one, I think that it's very important to think about these things because this is a policy that perhaps in the future could be implemented. The United States has tried to implement this in the past, right? Honestly, I don't remember any dates, but I do know that it was attempted in the past. What does that mean? That means that it could be attempted in the future and it could succeed. Even if it doesn't succeed, other countries could do it, and that could lead to enormous implications because a lot of trade is interconnected. If one country's communications have backdoors, that could mean that if we use their country's products, or if we're just related to that country in some way, we could also be affected. That means that has enormous implications, and hopefully this video has kind of introduced the world of encrypted communications and the pros and cons of whether or not we should have backdoors in them. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time. Have a great rest of your day. Bye!